guys, welcome back. First up, I just wanted to say that I felt bad about not getting a video out last weekend, but I kinda had a pet emergency that required me to spend a lot of time watching over him after a stray dog attack. And as always, pet health is more important than YouTube likes. But anyway, we're back this week, and I figured that we'd take another trip into the realm of Super Nintendo comic book games. They're actually some of my favorite games to browse through since you just never really know what you're gonna get with a lot of these. Games based on comic books should be awesome by default. They're literally made to be super-powered heroes. But more often than not with these games, you end up with something that feels anything but super-powered. Still, I'm feeling pretty optimistic this time, since we got a decent-looking lineup of superheroes this week, and I've only actually played one of them. So hopefully we'll come out of this with more wins than losses, or at least I hope we do. So let's start things off with a character who basically was the 90s in comic book form, and see if his Super NES game was worthy of the license, or just another one of those comic book games that should have stayed in the shadows. Spawn on the Super NES is the comic book equivalent of a filler issue, flashy but ultimately forgettable. Now, I personally loved Spawn when it first burst onto comic book shelves back in the early 90s. Todd McFarlane's debut issue back in 1992 was a pretty big deal to the comic book landscape. The comic instantly grabbed attention with McFarlane's signature art style, becoming the poster child for early 90s comic book edginess, dark, violent, and a really neat cape. Beyond the comics, we got an entire action figure line for kids, mind you, for a comic aimed squarely at adults, a not-so-great movie with some truly awful CG, and an amazing HBO animated series that really pushed the envelope for adult animation at the time. Oh, and yeah, a few video games.
Get used to it.
Spawn for the Super NES hit shelves back in 1995, developed by Ukiyo-Tei and published by Acclaim, which, yeah, that is kind of a weird combo for a game like this, but we'll circle back to that here in a second. By the time Spawn slithered onto the Super NES, though, the system was already jam-packed with enough beat-em-ups to feed a third-world nation, if third-world nations could consume beat-em-ups anyway. So Spawn had some serious competition right out of the gate. Start the game up and you take control of Spawn, going through multiple levels, punching bad guys straight to hell, and then going to hell and punching them there as well. And yeah, this is a pretty simple beat-em-up, but I don't really think simple is a bad thing here. The Ninja Warriors on the Super NES is a great example of how simple mechanics can still lead to an amazing game. But Spawn's kinda weird. It tries to look like it's a deep game, but ends up being way simpler than it actually is. You've got 2 light attacks, 2 heavy attacks, and even a dedicated block button, which is almost unheard of for beat-em-ups. You also get some dash moves by double-tapping left or right, and even a full set of special attacks using fighting game-style inputs. But really, why bother in the first place when you can just beat the entire game using your jump attack? It's literally just as effective as anything else in his arsenal, so why bother with the rest? Plus, there's no combos or anything like that. You just hit a guy once and they either die or stagger backwards and then recover before you can actually hit them again. Now, while combat doesn't really have a ton going on, the game does switch things up with a surprising amount of platforming. You're not just walking through levels and punching dudes all of the time. Instead, you'll be double jumping up walls to avoid gunfire or carefully hopping across tiny platforms suspended over fiery hell pits. Which again sounds cool, and in theory it is, but Spawn just doesn't control well enough to make it that much fun. The slower, slightly floaty movement that kinda works for the combat comes back to haunt you big time here. And it also doesn't help that Spawn's hitbox is absolutely massive, especially when he jumps, so you'll find yourself getting knocked out of the air constantly when you're just trying to make a simple jump. Still, I gotta give the game credit since it does try to break up the monotony with some variety here, even if the gameplay doesn't quite keep up with the visuals. And yeah, Spawn does look really good. Honestly, this might be the best thing about the game. It's another one of those games that really shines on a good CRT monitor if you got one, where the sprite work and color blending can really shine. And the visuals do a fantastic job of capturing Spawn's iconic look, and the enemies and backgrounds all have that dark, gritty tone that you'd expect from the comics. And that includes all of the comic panels that are there between each stage that tells the story of the game. I don't know if some of the artists from Image Comics drew some of these, but they look like they could have come straight from the comics. So if there's one thing that this game does right, it's the look. This is Spawn. And I'd go as far to say that this is the best looking Spawn game that's ever been made. But I guess that's really not saying too much. Now remember at the beginning of this video when I mentioned the developer Ukiyo-Tei? Well, you might think you never heard of him, and honestly I hadn't either, but it turns out that they developed a couple of my favorite Super NES games, both Hook and Sky Blazer. And if you played either of those games, then you know that these guys can make a good game. Sky Blazer in particular still holds up today. It's a fantastic game. So it's a little surprising that Spawn, while it does kind of feel familiar in its action and pacing, just doesn't quite hit the same level of fun that those two games managed to pull off. It's got the look, but just not quite the same level of polish. Overall though, I don't think Spawn on the Super NES is as bad as what magazines made it out to be back in the day. It's not great, and it's certainly not some sort of hidden classic, but if you're a die-hard Spawn fan, or you just have a soft spot for those edgy 90s comic book vibes like I do, there's more than enough here to justify a playthrough, and unlimited continues and passwords help a lot here as well. Just don't expect to be blown away by amazing gameplay or anything like that. It's a great looking beat 'em up that coasts way more on style than it does substance, and in a way, I guess that kind of makes it feel just like the comic. A fantastic looking game filled with style and shadows, but really not much else going on underneath it all. The Tick on the Super NES should have been a knockout, but what we got instead was a game that feels like it was programmed by people that had never even watched the show or read the comic. The Tick landed on the Super NES back in 1994, developed by Software Creations. And even though I was a pretty big fan of the Tick cartoon back in the day, I don't remember this game existing, like at all. And if you flip the box over, it actually doesn't look that bad. It looks like the cartoon and it's totally a beat 'em up, so I'm just not entirely sure how all of this ended up as bad as it is. Boot the game up, and yes, it is a beat 'em up, and that's fine, because like I said, I think the Tick should actually make for a good brawler. And really it doesn't seem too bad, at least not right out of the gate. It's kind of stiff feeling, and lining up attacks can be a pain since enemies just love to nestle inside the Tick's massive blue sprite, but I mean, overall, it's not offensively bad, at least at first. Mechanically though, there's not much going on. You get a punch button that cycles through the same looping combo animation with just a couple of variations, and there's a kick button too, and it's mainly only useful if you want to just admire the Tick's impressively sculpted cartoon calves. You also get a dedicated button to summon Arthur, the Tick's best friend, who swoops in and dive bombs enemies, taking out just about anyone that's on the screen. But beyond that, there's not much else going on here. There's almost no items or power-ups or really anything like that. I didn't even think there was a health pickup in this game until one just randomly showed up in like stage 5 out of nowhere. There is this weird team-up mechanic though, where one of the Tick's sidekick buddies jumps in and just literally glues themselves to your back, like there's some sort of fighting backpack or something. They attack whenever you attack, but all it really does is make it harder to hit anything. It can be hard enough just to line up one enemy, let alone two on the opposite side of the screen. It's possibly the most awkward implementation of a team-up mechanic that I've ever seen in a game, to the point where I just started avoiding these if I could. In a recent video, I called Batman Forever one of the most tedious beat-em-ups on the Super Nintendo, and I take that back because the Tick now holds that crown, and it's not even close. I have never played a brawler that felt this repetitive. You start the game off fighting some ninjas, and by the end of stage 1, I never wanted to see another ninja again in anything. I was playing through this rooftop level and I genuinely thought the game was broken because it just wouldn't end. But no, that's just how the game's designed. And it's pretty much like that for the entire game. And yeah, I did notice that the first level was called Night of a Million Zillion Ninjas, which is cute, I'll give you that, but it stopped being funny after about the first million ninjas. There are these kinda in-between levels that are more like a side-scrolling platforming game, just very basic, where all you do is just dodge stuff that's coming at you. Make it to the end and you're off to the next excruciatingly long beat-em-up level. But if you manage to fall, then you get taken to like these subplot stages sometimes, where you fight one of the game's many cameo characters in a boss fight. And the first time that happened, I was like, that's kinda neat. And in a better game, these would really help mix things up. But in the Tick, these bosses aren't fun at all. Like, they can either be too frustrating to even get through, or they can be super easy to the point where it takes no skill whatsoever. So it's just kind of tossed in there just as a fun thing, I guess, even though it's kind of boring. And I think that's my biggest problem with this game. It's just boring. Which is insane because the Tick should never be boring. This is a character that's built on absurdity and over-the-top parody. The cartoon was clever and genuinely funny, but the game just completely misses the joke. If you're persistent though, and I will say persistent, the game does eventually kinda open up. Later stages introduce new enemies, the backgrounds kinda get a little bit more interesting, and there are even some vaguely creative stages. Like this one, where two boats are switching places and you have to keep jumping in between them. But just like everything else in the game, the pacing is so atrocious and the repetition is so relentless that I wouldn't blame anyone for bailing on this game just a few minutes in. And really, that's what stings about this game, because I loved the Tick growing up. I still do. If I'd seen this game on the shelf at my local video store when I was a kid, I would have rented it in a heartbeat. And if I'd brought this one home and popped it into my Super Nintendo and realized what I got, well, I would have been crushed. To see one of my favorite cartoon and comic book characters relegated to this mess, yeah, I wouldn't have been too happy about it. And the sad thing is that there's just a little something here that kind of gives you a hint of what could have been. The art isn't bad at all, and the animation has flashes of personality, and there's even a faint trace of the cartoon's trademark humor. You can feel the idea of a good Tick game somewhere under all this garbage. But unfortunately, none of it matters when the actual game is this painful. There's not even a co-op mode, and this game is screaming for a co-op mode. So no, I don't recommend anyone play this game. If you're a fan of the Tick, then do yourself a favor and stick to the comics, or rewatch the cartoon, or just check out one of the live-action series. All of those still hold up in their own ways to this day. But the Super Nintendo version, this one's just a hard pass. A big blue, muscle-bound, soul-crushing pass. The Death and Return of Superman for the Super NES isn't just one of the best comic book games on the system, it's also one of the more entertaining beat-em-ups as well. Released back in 1994, The Death and Return of Superman is of course based on the famous comic arc where Superman bites the dust, and a bunch of new Supermen show up to take his place. And one look at the back of the box confirms that yes, this is another superhero beat-em-up.
Which was the style at the time.
But I guess if it works, then it works. So let's see if Supes on the Super NES works just as well. Now, considering that this was Blizzard's one and only stab at the beat-em-up genre, it's kinda wild just how well they nailed the basics. And yes, I am talking about that Blizzard, the World of Warcraft Blizzard. But before they went on to become one of the biggest developers in the universe, they were slumming it up on consoles making comic book beat-em-ups. And surprisingly, they got a lot of the stuff right on their first try that a lot of developers never even figured out. To play the game, you got your standard ground combos to take out most enemies with, and you can also grab them and toss them across the screen. Plus, you got a quick laser blast to stun enemies as well. And since this is a Superman game, you get the ability to fly around the screen whenever you want if you just hold the jump button down. And it's not just for show, since there are actually several sections of the game where you have to fight enemies while flying. And I think that's one of the coolest things about the game because it actually makes you use all of this stuff. It's not just there for flash like it was in Spawn. The stage design and enemy behavior actually push you to mix up your attacks and use everything at your disposal. And if you don't, then you're gonna be eating floor in no time. Besides, it's just a blast to smash guys into the background or fly around and punch guys out of the air. Also, it's just kind of hilarious watching Superman toss dudes off the top of a building. There's even a few times where the game turns into a full-on side-scrolling shooter as well. It's pretty neat when it happens, but they usually don't last too long. That being said though, the game's not without some frustrations. There's a big focus on crowd control here. Enemies love to swarm you, and if you don't keep them spaced out, then you're almost guaranteed to get smacked around. You need to try your best to take each enemy out one-on-one, since you can't actually attack multiple targets at once like most beat-em-ups. It's not impossible to manage, but it can get overwhelming at times, especially at first. And it's also just annoying because, well, you're playing as Superman, and you'd think Superman would be able to handle this stuff. Or at least one of the Supermen should be able to do that, because just like the comic, you'll be playing as each of the imposter Supermen that show up after Doomsday sends Superman to the great beyond. And while they all look distinct enough, none of them really play that much different from each other besides maybe Superboy being smaller and faster, and Steel using his gigantic hammer to take enemies out with. Overall though, none of them really changed the gameplay up in any sort of crazy way, but it is really cool that Blizzard went out of their way to make sure that you could play as each one of these super dudes, even if they don't always feel as super as they should. And that leads right into my biggest issue with the game. Besides flying around, none of these Supermen really feel all that super. No matter which one you're playing as, you can still get knocked down like a bullied 5th grader by a group of street thugs. And yeah, I mean, I get it, it's a video game, and that's kind of what has to happen in these kind of games, but it's Superman. And I don't care what anyone says, there is no comic, movie, or game where a crack addict in a random alley can drop Superman just by throwing a few punches. It just kind of breaks the whole super illusion. And it's not so bad with some of the more alien or robotic enemies, but it's hard to feel like the strongest being on Earth when you're curled up on the ground from a greaser riding a motorcycle. Now, one thing I always liked about early Blizzard games was just how chunky their games looked. And this game is chunky, and I don't mean that in like a bad pixelated way or anything like that. I mean that more in like a distinct art style that Blizzard had going on during their 16-bit days. You can see it across a lot of their early work. The big, ridiculous alien designs in Rock and Roll Racing, the darker look of Blackthorn and its levels, it all just has this gritty, dark, chunky look to it, and I love it. And that's really the only way that I can describe it, and it's all over Superman here as well. If I had to nitpick, I'd say the color palette leans a little bit too dark for this game. It's all deep reds, dark blues, grays, and blacks, but I mean honestly, I guess it fits the darker tone of the story. And visually, the game does lean into that darker, grittier comic book look. From the backgrounds to the enemy designs, the art direction's just really solid here, like most Blizzard games are. It might not be Konami level polish, but Blizzard did a great job of making a comic book beat 'em up that looks the part. Blizzard wasn't exactly known for brawlers because this was way outside their usual comfort zone. And really, now that I think about it, I'm not entirely sure what their comfort zone was, since they made a bunch of weird-ass games back then. But this time they turned in a damn good game here. It's not perfect and it doesn't always hit that superhero power fantasy, but it still delivers where it counts, a fun combat and a faithful adaptation of the source material. So whether you're a Superman fan or just curious to see early Blizzard doing something way outside their usual wheelhouse, the death and return of Superman is absolutely worth checking out. It might not be the Man of Steel's finest moment, but it is one of his more underrated ones, and for a single attempt at a beat-em-up, Blizzard came a lot closer to greatness with this one than anyone had any right to expect.
The Avengers!
Captain America and the Avengers for the Super NES is one of the most disappointing arcade ports I've ever played. The arcade version of Captain America and the Avengers was kind of a big deal back in the day, and I loved this game when I was a kid. Like every time I walked into an arcade, this was the cabinet that I was looking for. And for what it's worth, this is the game that really got me into beat-em-ups. Final Fight was fun and all, but this is the game that defined that entire genre for me for quite a while. So when Captain America and the Avengers finally made its way to the Super Nintendo in 1993, I grabbed this one as soon as I saw it. The arcade version came out in 1991, so the Super NES version was long overdue at that point, and that may have been a hint at what was to come. But at first glance, things seemed okay with this one. The back of the box made it look like a pretty decent arcade port. But unfortunately, this ended up being one of the most disappointing games that I ever played on the system. Now, to be fair, first impressions aren't terrible. The game does open up with the same comic book style intro from the arcade version, complete with the same bad voice samples.
America still needs your help!
And then you get to pick from all of the characters that were in the arcade. Cap pretty much does everything well. He's got decent speed, decent power, and his shield toss is easily one of the best ranged attacks in the game since it acts like a boomerang. Iron Man plays best when you stay back and blast dudes with his lasers. He's not much of a brawler, but he makes up for it by frying enemies from the air. Hawkeye, no surprise, is your long-range guy. He can fire arrows to keep enemies back, but his health bar doesn't last long if anyone gets too close. And finally, there's Vision, and he's kind of the muscle of the group since he hits hard and can take a few more punches than everyone else, but he's a little bit slower. He's also got a laser like Iron Man to use when he needs to, but he's definitely more of a close quarters guy. Now, having said all of that, that's how these characters should play, and in the arcade, they do play like that. But on the Super Nintendo, everything just starts falling apart as soon as you get into the game. Technically, yeah, each character still has all their unique moves from the arcade, but the Super NES version feels nothing like the arcade game. The fast and fluid movement from the characters in the arcade game is completely absent here. The enemies in this version are relentless. They swarm you, and half the time there's no way to stop them from beating you down. You can try to fight fair, like in the arcade, but you'll get punished for it. The only reliable way to make progress with any of the characters is just to find a move that cheeses the AI and then repeat it over and over. And even then, it's not fun. It's just exhausting. You're essentially just playing keep away the entire game. This version of the game somehow managed to make some of the most powerful characters in Marvel history feel like they're no match for even the weakest enemies in this game. In a previous video that I brought this game up, a lot of the comments said that the Genesis version was actually a lot better. And I can confirm that yes, it is a lot better. The Genesis port isn't perfect, but it plays way closer to the arcade version. It's faster, more responsive, and actually feels like the game that I remember playing back in the arcade. I have no idea what happened to the Super NES version. It definitely came out later than the Genesis port, and maybe the whole thing was rushed out the door to get some of that hot Super Nintendo money, but it honestly feels like they didn't care either way. And in the end, what we ended up getting was a game that you rent once, play for an hour, and then immediately regret wasting your $4 on it. And if you couldn't tell, that was me. So do yourself a favor and don't make the same mistake that I did. Skip the Super NES version entirely, and if you're craving some Captain America and the Avengers, go play the Genesis port. It's really good. Or better yet, just go find the arcade version somewhere and experience for yourself why this game was such a big deal to a lot of us kids back in the day. And I think that's going to do it for me this week, guys. And honestly, I think we pulled off a pretty solid run, since there were actually at least a couple of games that I didn't completely hate, so I'll take that as a win any day. The Death and Return of Superman was the surprise of the week for me though, since I definitely wasn't expecting that game to be as good as it is. But really, when you're sharing screen time with Captain America and the Avengers or The Tick, just about anything's gonna look like Game of the Year contenders. But what did I miss this time? I know there are still a few Super NES comic book games that I haven't gotten around to, so feel free to shout at me in the comments about them, because I know that's what a lot of you love to do. And if you happen to like this video, then go ahead and give it a like, and maybe even a sub if you want to see some more superhero videos just like this one in the future. But that's going to do it for me this week, kids. Check back next week for some more games to talk about, but until then, thanks for watching, Super Soldiers.